Hey everybody, it's Pastor Ryan here with you today with this week's Family Encourager. So often we have a little bit of an object lesson and something that could be a little bit more fun around the family table. But for my own personal devotion this week, I came across a reading that I greatly enjoy. One that I even based this week's shut-in sermon on, some of our bonus mailings that go out to those who are not otherwise connected online and that kind of a thing. It made such an impact in my personal study this week. I thought, yes, I can write a short sermon about it, and yes, it should be the one perhaps that comes to you so that you can talk about it around your kitchen tables. It's the story of a man with a withered hand. As it turns out, Jesus is on his way to church and he's going to be teaching, and there happens to be a crowd that wants to meet him there. There's also a crowd of Jesus' own enemies that's ready to challenge him, and there just happens to be those who are on their way to church and going home just simply because they expected that that's where God was going to meet them. For the man that we meet in Mark's Gospel today, it might not seem like he was there simply to be healed, but Jesus made some demands of him that helped to restore him in body, in mind, and in soul. So I'd like you to listen to this otherwise familiar story from the Gospels and maybe to already think about the things that you present to God, whether it might be an offering that you give at church, or maybe most especially these days when it comes to the way that you share gifts with one another, that you bless one another in your homes, and maybe even better yet, the way that you perhaps bless your neighbors with gifts, with services, with all of those things that would help the people of the world know that God loves them. Celebrating the word of the Lord today, I'll share with you from Mark chapter 3. This is what St. Mark says. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue. It's another fancy word for a school or a church, very similar to the kind of church that we have today, where you have worship and Sunday school and Bible study. Synagogue. Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered, shriveled hand. They watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they could accuse him of disobeying God. Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And so as the man came, he said to the crowd, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" And the crowd went silent. So he looked around with them at anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart. He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And so he stretched out his hand, and his hand in that moment was restored. It's a very short story. It's only 5 verses long. Jesus is there to teach, but before he teaches, he calls out to a man in the crowd who has a withered or shriveled, a hand that this man probably hasn't been able to use for some time. Jesus knows that he wants to heal the man, even though the man isn't exactly asking for healing. He uses this man as an example to teach the crowd what it is to be good on the Sabbath. See, in Jesus' day, when it came time for your Sabbath rest, kind of mimicking the way that God rested on the 7th day after he created the world, there were many who thought that they could not do anything on the Sabbath except for worship. And so with that, sometimes people were in need of help, but people would say, "No, I can't help you today because today is the Sabbath day." Jesus did a number of miracles and teachings on different Sabbaths, and every time he did this, he proved that it was better to show acts of love and kindness that would bring God glory on the day that we're meant to worship him. As if to say, we know how much God loves us, but now it's time for us to make a response. Jesus calls the man forward, and he sets him up in front of the crowd, and he says, "Stretch out your hand." I don't know what it would be like for you, but if any teacher, most especially Jesus, told me to do something so simple, I would do it. Now, Jesus certainly knows the heart and the mind of the man who could not use his hand. We don't have the ability to know just how much that this disability or this inconvenience or disease, as a setback, maybe it greatly frustrated the man. Maybe it helped him to depend upon God more. We can't know the thoughts and the heart of the man. Only Jesus can know that. But I know if it were me, I would only say and speak for myself, it probably would have caused a little bit of tension, probably would have caused some trust issues and some doubt. If I knew that God loved me, but I didn't have the use of my hands, I think that would be a rather hard life for me personally. Now, there are many that I know who are otherwise either inconvenienced or perhaps disabled or face disease or other types of distress. And yet there are some who are completely content, and I respect them. And with that respect comes the way that they show their faith in God, even in spite of things that would otherwise make the rest of us look to heaven and say, God, why? Or maybe even think for a moment, sadly, that God didn't love us. But we can see from this man who had the shriveled hand, he certainly loved God. Whether he knew that Jesus was going to be at the synagogue or not that day, it seemed to be his model that he was going to be at his church just because God promised to be there in different ways. Maybe he went there for encouragement or to get strength so he could continue on with life. Maybe there were people who sought his wisdom. Maybe they were diseased or maybe they were injured, and perhaps there maybe the man with the shriveled hand could give them encouragement. Whatever happened, we only have the precious few verses that we have. Jesus shows up on the scene, he commands the man to come forward, and as that man listens to God and presents the offering of a shriveled hand, the moment that he presents it to God, Jesus heals him. He restores him. He brings him back to full motion and perhaps life as he knew it before that malady or that illness came into play. I'd like you to think today perhaps not so much of the man, but certainly quite a bit about Jesus and the way that you approach him. Adults, if you're listening in, we know that sometimes when we present offerings to God, the best that we can produce are these shriveled and withered offerings. But it seems to me from the text that we have, this is what Jesus is asking for, because the moment that we surrender our feeble selves or our inability to carry ourselves, that's the moment where he holds out his hands to receive those offerings, to transform them by his perfect and holy obedience and power, and then sends us away restored, and rather to continue to give, not simply to God in his church, but to surrender ourselves and sacrifice and give according to the kingdom work that he's already planned in advance for us to do. As you bring offerings to God's house, as you share his gifts with one another, I pray that for however as withered and shriveled as your offerings may feel at times, know that in God's hands they are transformed, they are holy, they are precious, priceless, and made perfect just as he commands. May God bless you as you continue to go about your lives loving the Lord, serving him, and of course, loving and serving your neighbor. In his name, God bless you and good health. We'll see you soon.